Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Brad, apparently, and also Brad, because we're both named Brad right now. And so this is going to be part two of defending against ransomware for the podcast. So welcome back. And in part one, we really kind of talked about why we think ransomware is a threat, and maybe some conceptual preparation that you can do. And so if you guys missed that episode, I highly encourage you to go back and check it out. But the episodes will stand on their own either way, so no big deal. So today we're going to talk about more specific controls, more specific things and tasks for you to go look at in both your external and internal environments. So we separate those out because they generally kind of differ a little bit with regards to their controls. So do you want to get started on the external?
Yeah, definitely. So the first thing I think is an important discussion point is just knowing your attack surface, right? I put asset inventory. I think it's more encompassed than that, right? It's your external attack surface, which might include both on-prem services, websites. It might include cloud services or third-party services. It could even include social media, right?
Yep.
Especially if you're a large, like multinational, like multi-region organization, it can encompass a lot of things. So external attack surface, I think, is really important. The DBIR that we just did a podcast on the DBIR, and 14% of all the breaches, they had vulnerability exploitation occurred in 14% of all the breaches in the data set.
And that's up, right? That's an increase.
It was up. It tripled from the previous year. So right. 14% exploited vulnerabilities as a means of initial access, which means there's more things on the internet and there's more things vulnerable on the internet. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, and you can speak to this too, Brad, is like a lot of times we'll find things on the internet that organizations didn't know they had, or they didn't realize it was out of date, or they didn't realize, it could be that bad. In the case of like RDP and things like that, or other portals that allow remote access. So asset inventory, kind of external attack surface, is the first discussion point I wanted to bring up, and kind of managing that and being aware of what you have out there, both from an IT perspective, shadow IT, and everything in between.
Totally agree, man. So on, just speaking from a pure pen testing perspective, probably 50% of our external penetration tests, we discover something that they didn't know they had, or they forgot they had, or maybe that they didn't think was exposed to the public internet. And in some of these cases, it has led to, domain admin, for example. And so in one case, we found a remote access server that was in a completely different environment. And they were unaware that it was there. We were able to get in through compromised dark web credentials and elevate to domain admin. That's a scary situation for somebody to be in, man. And so we've even found AS400s on the internet, like in the middle of a pen test, and everybody's like, "Whoa, why is that on the internet?" And so not knowing what you have is kind of party foul number one. And so I contend that your asset management is a security function, even though in most organizations it's not. It's an IT function. But honestly, how are you going to secure it if you don't know it's there? And all of the things that go along with managing high risk systems, and I would propose any system that bridges your internal network to your external network is a high risk system. Is just knowing that they're there, and knowing what's on them too, right? What services are listening, and the state of those is super important. It's really step one.
Yeah, and I just think, just coming from us both coming from this world of IT, right, and security, we used to do this as our day job, being defenders and stuff. And, I think we have the same mindset. It's like, if it doesn't absolutely need to be on the internet for some reason, like if it's not making us money, if it's not there for some really, really good reason, try your hardest not to put it on the internet, right?
Yep.
Firewall it, put it behind a VPN or some reverse proxy or something to just give it a little bit extra cushion.
Yep. And here's a controversial topic, right? Being on the internet is not binary. It's not absolute. You can filter traffic to all the ports you don't want to be exposed to the internet. And I understand that in a lot of cases, you don't have control over what services are listening on a particular, system because it's mandated by the vendor or whatever. But man, with the technology we have today with layer 7 firewalls and WAFs,
Yep.
man, you can really control to a high degree
Yep.
what is listening, and even in some cases, what types of traffic can reach a service that is publicly available.
Yep.
And so, leverage those tools, kind of like we talked about in episode 1. You have the tools at your disposal. You need to be
Yep.
using them.
Yep. And along with attack surface, external especially, is patching, right? I'm famously quoted as saying like 99% of vulnerabilities don't matter. It's the 1% that are going to hurt you. You just don't happen to know what the 1% is.
Right.
The problem is anything on the internet, once there's a vulnerability, once there's an exploit, it will be sprayed. It will be attempted, very soon. I don't know if we have hardcore statistics about it, but and I can't remember the specifics of bigger exploits like Log4j or those, but within 24 hours, I think it's fair. I think if it's on the internet and there's any kind of vulnerability, especially one that has potential to be widely exploited or exploited at all, should probably be patched within 24 hours. And there's some data to support this. And going back to the DBIR, I'm gonna be a shill for the DBIR in a lot of these episodes because I like referring to the data as indicators of things to understand.
Yeah.
And in the DBIR, they referenced that after, I think it was 90 days, only 50% or something like that of the vulnerabilities have been patched and remediated. Yeah. And if you look at like Log4j or Avanti Connect or Screen Connect or any of the big vulnerabilities, if you haven't patched it in 90 days, like there's problems. Like you're probably already compromised. There's probably already an incident going on. So you have to be able to respond to those quickly and be nimble enough to patch those systems super, super quickly.
Yeah, and it's something that we picked up on the financial industry, 10, 15 years ago. And our philosophy was, a vulnerability is not the same as a vulnerability. And what I mean by that is this may be high risk, but is it high risk on my internal network? Is that the same as on my external network? And in most cases, the answer to that is that they are different. The probabilities of an insider threat leveraging an RCE on an internal system is statistically much smaller than someone leveraging that same exploit on an externally facing publicly available system. So we ended up building what we called a high-risk patching process that operated completely outside of our normal patch management process, right? Because most people have, if you're relatively mature, you're going to have a patch management process that's going to say, high risks have to be patched in 7 days, mediums have to be patched in a month, and maybe whatever it is. I'm just kind of making numbers up here. Yep. But if you wait 7 days to patch an actively exploited high risk system on a publicly facing box, you're going to get jacked up, man. And so you really have to treat them differently, and aggressively go after patching those. And so, you just have to keep that context in mind. Context is everything.
Yeah. And if you can't patch those systems quickly, you have to find a way to get those off the internet. You have to find a way you have to find some other mitigating control, right? Like compensating control, like the CISSP language. Like, you have to find some other compensating thing to protect that. Well, maybe it's a DMZ, maybe it's something else, but.
Yeah, and we had a number of different approaches for stuff like that. If it was a web application vulnerability, we'd put it behind a WAF and we'd virtually patch it. If it's a network-based vulnerability and you have the ability to put an IPS out in front of that and make sure that you have rules loaded for that specific type of thing, do that. In a lot of cases, there are options that go beyond just pushing an untested patch into a production environment, because I'm certainly not advocating for that.
Yep.
But yeah, you got to do something, because otherwise you're going to be a statistic in a DBIR next year.
Yep. Along with the external, kind of going with the external section here and theme of this part 2 is conditional access, geofencing, restricting authentications to your environment from specific locations. So this kind of ties into what we said in part one of like using the tools at your disposal, right? If you are a US only company and none of your employees travel, then maybe it's realistic to geofence in your business so that they can only log in from certain states or from certain countries, or things like that. You can do that with Entra. You can do that with firewalls. Conditional access is a Microsoft Entra thing, right? There are similar utilities in other platforms, other identity providers, but conditional access is great. You can, and so is geofencing, right?
Yeah.
You can restrict access from a lot of those, high risk countries. Now, that's
Yeah.
not to say that threat actors aren't going to use an American ISP or American VPS, or something like that, because they often do. But if you can weed out some of that traffic and you can eliminate it outright, it's better than not.
Yeah, it's a layered approach like anything else, man. This is not the silver bullet, but it is one of many components to a well-structured security system. And yeah, man, I mean, we had a conversation with a client last week about that where we were launching attacks from other countries via via some cloud hosting. And we were like, "Hey man, do you do business in North Korea? Block them."
Yep.
Right? So yeah, where possible, I think you should absolutely be leveraging that because it's probably available in whatever technology stack you're using.
Yep. And that's a topic I think we can go into a lot of depth on. I think Darius would be a good candidate to kind of dig into a lot of the conditional access stuff because of his background. But that one is definitely one I think organizations they're underutilizing. When we do cloud assessments or even when we do internal pen tests and we're able to pivot, we notice that there's some misconfigurations that happen quite commonly. And a lot of it is around kind of strong authentication, meaning, if you're on network, you don't have to MFA prompt. You just log right in, it's SSO everything, and then away you go. Yeah. So if I'm a threat actor and I get access to a system, even if it's like a remote user, if you're logging in from a compliant device, a lot of times those conditional access policies don't enforce a reauthentication or you to renegotiate the session. That's why session token and session theft is such a big issue right now, is because that token lifetime is so long that the user never has to reauthenticate. They never are prompted for MFA. So a lot of those out of the box configurations aren't as strong as they could be. So we got to do another episode like just on that, because I think there's a lot of area for improvement there.
No question.
So it ties in the next one, which is strong MFA.
Yep.
We see this all the time on externals when we do social engineering engagements. If we're doing any kind of like prompt bombing or things like that, the first most obvious thing to me is making sure that your MFA is consistent with your threat model, right? So if you're up against threats that are gonna password spray and prompt bomb you until users click yes, having push notifications is probably not the best option, although it's better than not having it.
Yeah.
But there are other stronger methods of MFA. So number matching is one that comes to mind, right? Yeah. There are physical tokens, there's passwordless kind of authentication, there's Windows Hello and all those biometric things. But having strong MFA and having good coverage and having it enforced everywhere is really key. On pretty much every internal engagement, when I get admin creds and I log into Entra, I'm almost never prompted for MFA because of, again, those conditional access policies and weak MFA enforcement. Yep. So this is something that is very, very critical.
No, I completely agree. And I am never more surprised than when we're doing external pen testing and we come up on systems that we're able to spray or credential stuff that don't have MFA. And I think a lot of people maybe treat certain systems as though they're less important, and they're all part of your ecosystem. And they're generally going to be ties back into your production environment, even if that system is hosted by a SaaS or a third party. We run into that all the time. So strong MFA, and you nailed it, man. Across the board, applied to everything.
Yep. And as best you can, restrict the exceptions, right? There's always going to be those exceptions of people that don't like it or get frustrated by it, or, they're the ones that sign the check. I understand those are difficult conversations, but having those conversations, I think, is important in helping people understand the impact. If this account's compromised, there's no MFA on it, or if there's no other protections, like here's how bad it could be, and helping people understand that, because I do think we do hear from time to time that there's exceptions made, or there's people that want exceptions, and guess what? Those are the accounts that get compromised. Those are the accounts that have BECs. That's a lot of times where it starts.
Yeah, but that's an education problem, in my opinion, right? They don't truly understand the risk, and it's our job or your job as an IT or security administrator to educate them and let them understand, why it's such a big deal. Because at the end of the day, they're not going to get fired for a breach occurring on their watch. It's going to be you, even though you may have been forced to make that make that exception. So just kind of keep that in mind.
And a lot of this stuff it's like the human. It's the soft skill things. Like we know a lot of the technical things that we need to do, but a lot of times we have resource constraints, we have lack of support, we have lack of education, and it's a lot of that stuff that goes a long way. The tech stuff, we know we need these things. We know what we have to put in place in a general sense. It's just a matter of doing it and getting it implemented and getting support for it.
Agreed.
So anything else in the external section that you wanted to cover? Obviously, so for everybody listening, these are not exhaustive lists of things of like do everything. If you do these all, you're going to be defended against ransomware. These are some of the ones I think commonly come up in discussion. I think are important ones to talk about. So any other ones from the external perspective?
Not really, man. We didn't really talk about doing vulnerability assessments, vulnerability scanning, things like that. But, those are obviously fundamental building blocks of a strong InfoSec program. So, if you're not doing that, you can do that literally for free with something like OpenVAS or some other tools. And I mean, even a Nessus Pro license is a couple grand. So there's really no excuse for not scanning your stuff and knowing where they stand. So that's really the only thing I would add to that.
Yeah, I think, if you're relying on a pen test or a security assessment to tell you you have some external vulnerabilities, it's already too late.
Yeah.
You should already know about those things in a mature program.
I agree. So internal. What kind of internal things can we do to kind of bolster ourselves against ransomware?
Yeah. So this is kind of like my stomping ground, right? Like this is my core area of expertise. It's what I am most passionate about. It's what I'm most educated about and experienced with. The downside is it's an area we have the least amount of data to support when it comes to like data breaches and security incidents, right? There'll be, the recent news of Avanti Connect. There was a certificate template abuse in that. There has been other reports and stuff that indicate some Active Directory internal network type misconfigurations that have been abused. But a large part of security incidents and data breaches, we don't necessarily get to see, what was the vulnerability that they took advantage of to get admin credentials or to move laterally or whatever the case may be. We get to see, what they used for lateral movement and what they used for defense evasion and C2 and those kinds of things. But we don't get to see a lot of times, did they abuse a certificate template? Did they, did they Kerberos? Sometimes in a lot of those reports, I feel like some of that is missing. And so I'm trying to do more research to find a lot of those articles that surface that. And obviously some of the big events, I think it was Okta maybe was one where they got access to like a password vault and they had some internal misconfigurations. So we do hear some about those in the bigger, well-known breaches. So that being said, a lot of those things just don't come to light as often. But we see those things on pen tests. We see those things from time to time in articles. So we know what threat actors are abusing them, and it just makes sense, right? If I can, scan your file shares, find a text file with credentials in them, and then log into the domain controller with those credentials, I'm probably going to do that, right? That's a lot easier than dumping LSAS, trying to evade EDR, or trying to turn it off and potentially raising alert. I'm going to follow the path of least resistance. And that's really what this comes down to in my mind when it comes to internal issues is what's the quickest way that can make the least amount of noise? It's going to get me to my end goal, which is domain admin, full compromise, right? Full network control.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that scares me more than anything with regards to this specific topic is, I think everybody thinks that you've got to come in with some whiz bang stuff to do an internal pen test. And I think what a lot of people maybe don't realize is it's a lot easier than you think in most cases to get elevated privileges, because users might have access to file shares that belong to IT, and there's batch files, or there might be login scripts or whatever it is that are operating under elevated privileges.
Yep.
And the attackers will leverage those before they're going to run some custom written exploit that's obfuscated in Rust.
Yep.
And so don't get me wrong, that's cool and that's sexy, but if I can just literally search your Microsoft file share for the word password, why would I do anything else?
Yep. Exactly. And that's the first one, is audit file shares for credentials. This is probably the number one finding on all internals.
Yep.
Probably every single engagement, we find some sort of credentials on file shares. It might not be file share specifically. It might be SharePoint, it might be OneDrive, it might be
Yep.
Box, whatever your document repository is. It might be your document management system, which is also a very common place to look. So auditing file shares for credentials is a great way to not only frustrate pen testers when they come in because they're not going to have anything, but attackers too. Like attackers will run ShareFinder. They will look in the shares and they will find those things. I guarantee it. They will find them. If they're out there, they will find them. They're very determined.
Yep.
And it doesn't make a lot of noise, right? And this is a place where the deceptive technology we talked about in episode 1 or part 1 really can go a long way. It's like, okay, I know threat actors are going to be looking here. I know they're going to be digging in these file shares. Let's put some honey files or some canaries here that they will trip over, right? Like maybe you call it admin.txt in like a file share, like a couple layers deep. They're probably going to find it and they're probably going to open that document, right? So having alerts for that, but right out of the gate, just searching, whatever you have to do. I posted something on LinkedIn the other day. It was like, just go out to your file shares, go to the Explorer, like the search box, and just type in password. Like just do that. If you've never done it, just do that, and you'll find a whole bunch of stuff. Then you can start using some tools to automate it and to kind of get a little bit more advanced. But just doing that is a great start.
Agreed, 100%, man. And it's so easy. And like you said, a big part of the reason that scares me is it's not going to get picked up, the behavior itself, unless you are taking precautions. So.
And a lot of times it's a difference between fully compromising an environment and not. Like if we didn't find this one credential file on a file share, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere.
Yeah.
Like there would have been findings, but we wouldn't have been as successful as we were.
Yeah.
Likewise with this engagement Darius is doing this week, it's like, if he didn't find what he had found, like it might not have been as enjoyable as an experience as a pen tester.
Well, you don't want us to have fun. You really don't. So you want us to be frustrated.
Yeah. We want to frustrate attackers.
Yeah.
Which leads to the next point, which is local admins.
Yeah.
That's another really common finding, and it's a very low hanging fruit item, and it's very easy to fix. But the issue is that local admin accounts are non-unique, or the passwords are not unique. So when you spin up a Windows machine or you go through your deployment process, a lot of IT shops will have like a default password, right? If you don't change that default password, then that password is likely going to be the same for all of the local admin accounts on all of your systems. And the reasons that is bad is if I get the local admin password or even the hash, I can then use that password to log into all those other systems, which obviously is bad. You don't want threat actors just to be able to move in your environment, free will, willy-nilly. So having unique local admin passwords is a really key defensive control. And you can do that with LAPS.
I was going to say, I feel like there should be a tool for this. I feel like maybe Microsoft should have made something to solve this problem.
Microsoft LAPS, Windows LAPS, there's an old version, there's a new version. It's mostly the same, but it's LAPS. It's local admin password solution. It randomizes the local admin password on all the machines. It's managed in Active Directory. You secure it with ACLs within Active Directory, and it's great. You can set it up in just a few minutes, and you're good to go.
Love it. Yep. All right. So moving along. What about we're on the subject of credentials anyway. So talk to me about the concept of least privilege and how that applies here.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of as we move through like an attack chain, we think about, okay, I'm a threat actor. I get access to a machine, right? Maybe I find credentials that get me access to a server or something, let's say. Maybe they're not full domain admin. Maybe it's just like a local admin account or some account that gives me access to a server, right? Let's say I'm a threat actor. I pivot to that server, right? What's very common is domain admin accounts will be used to configure scheduled tasks or to install software where services are running. So if you get access to a server, now I might have potentially access to these admin accounts that are doing things in the background. Least privilege and tiered administration is really important because if I'm a threat actor and I get access to that server and there's scheduled tasks or services running under the context of domain admins, well, now I can just log in as that domain admin. I can reconfigure that script. So least privilege is important to kind of separate our access model so that if a threat actor gets local admin, they can't just fully compromise everything. Mm-hmm. So least privilege says you have the least amount of privileges to kind of do your job or whatever that role is for that account and nothing more. And that is followed really closely by the tiered administration model, which is you have different levels of administration. So you have different levels, like you have a workstation admin, you have a server admin, you have a domain admin, and you have different levels of accounts. And you think of it like lanes of a highway, and you can't cross those lanes with those accounts. And that helps kind of harden your environment so that if I get access to one system, I can't just fully compromise everything else.
Yep. No, that makes perfect sense. And I think this is a difficult thing to implement retroactively. So the sooner that you can implement this from a process and a policy perspective, the sooner that you can kind of move in that direction and phase out systems, that are the old way, if you will.
Yeah, tiered admin model is definitely a culture change for a lot of organizations because, if people have DBAs or application administrators or just network admins in general, most of them just have like the regular account that they use every day, and then they have like their admin account. The admin account has access to workstations, to servers, to the virtual environment, to the backups, to Active Directory. They're also an enterprise admin and everything else. Yep. So if that one account is compromised, you literally have access to the entire environment. Yep. So it is a bit of a culture change. It's a bit of a shift for teams to make. But the organizations that do it well, we've seen are just harder environments to attack. On internal pen tests, during security assessments, they're just harder targets because we might get a credential, but it's only going to let us move laterally. We can't move vertically and compromise the full domain. So the impact is limited.
Yeah, good. All right, so taking that to the next step, let's talk a little bit about network segmentation. And I think even though we have these two topics kind of tied together, they're a little bit different in their implementation and probably better together.
So network segmentation and outbound web DNS filtering. So I put these two together because these are two that one is a little bit easier than the other, I think, and that is the web DNS filtering. I think is a little bit easier than segmentation or segregation. Depending on your vernacular and what you like to use. I think of segmentation as this like subnetting. So like just different VLANs, different subnets. They're not necessarily logically separated or separated in the sense that you can't communicate with the different subnets.
Right.
Segregation, in my mind goes like, okay, segregation is like actually separate environments.
Can't talk to each other.
Separate networks that can't communicate.
Yep.
So that's what I think of when I think of segmentation/segregation is making your environment so that if I don't need to communicate to the server network, then that's not allowed, either through the Windows firewall or through your EDR or whatever other technology you might have. Mm-hmm. A lot of your workstations probably don't need to communicate with every single server, right? And vice versa.
And what we see. First of all, that's a huge challenge to execute successfully. But what we see in organizations that do this successfully is it's not 100% segregation, segmentation. And so, they might either blacklist specific ports that are known to be risky, or whitelist only communication that's necessary for like application traffic, for example, or
Yep.
authentication traffic. But generally speaking, workstation subnets don't need to SMB to server subnets, right? Only to file shares. And workstation subnets don't need to RDP into server subnets and things of that nature. And
Mhm.
so, there are that you can make this a progressive policy that kind of goes step by step so that you don't break your entire network by just chopping entire chunks of it off. Um, but you could start with things that are known for lateral movement in these playbooks that we talk about, and attack those first. There's almost never a scenario where my secretary needs to RDP into an application server.
Yep.
Almost never, right?
And WinRM, PS remoting. If you're not using it, you can turn it
Turn
off
it
for the
off.
most part.
Yep.
Or if you are using it, number one, you should have an alert if a low privileged system is trying to WinRM or PS remote to a DC. And two, you can restrict that with the firewall as well.
Hmm. Yep.
And with web DNS filtering, this is something that can be very frustrating for attackers, because if you have good outbound filtering, their hosts
Command
are
and
not going to,
control.
or their C2 is going to break. They're not going to be able to get their payloads in. They're not going to be able to communicate with their C2 channels.
Yeah.
So it's going to be very important that you have strong DNS web content filtering.
Yep, absolutely, man. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the conditional access we were talking about earlier. You can block entire swaths of the internet for DNS and 80 and 443. One of the things that we've seen probably more often than I would like to see, though, is people who only do web traffic. And you need to
Mm.
understand the threat actors are out there using things like SSH and Telnet and TFTP and other types of protocols. And in a lot of cases, they're tunneling traffic through things like DNS, which, by the
Yep.
way, you can kill by forcing all DNS resolution to occur internally and filtering outbound DNS
Yep.
recursion and things like that. So, there are ways to defeat these common threat actor techniques. And I just encourage you guys to explore that,
Yep.
because it's a low or no cost implementation. And with there's some hiccups involved, right? Occasionally you're going to block something somebody needs, but
Yep.
you know, after you get this thing implemented, that should be just a help desk ticket and move on. So I say
Yep.
that to say it's not super painful to implement necessarily.
Yep. Now I'm going to pivot a little bit to EDR,
Okay.
and use EDR as kind of a variable or a placeholder for just security monitoring in general.
Hmm.
But EDR, so uh, it's one of those things that we hate recommending a tool. Like we hate going out and buying a tool, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't have a quality endpoint security product, if you're just using antivirus or some even commercial antivirus or something like that, you're definitely not doing your environment justice.
Yeah.
It definitely pays dividends to have a good quality EDR. Now there are a number of EDR products, and there's a lot that are doing really good. There's
Yep.
a handful that we think, from a pen test perspective and offensive security perspective, that are better than others
Yep.
right now, but that ebbs and flows, right? Brad, you've got stories about Carbon Black. Carbon Black was one of the first to do like app control and things like that, and it was ahead of its time. Since it's fallen off a little bit. So there are a number of EDR products that are top tier. There's some that are still really, really good. And my point with kind of bringing up the EDR discussion is one of continuous tuning and care and nurturing and feeding, right? Continuously improving, continuously staying up to date. So it's not enough now to just have an EDR, right? You can't just have an EDR or have a SOC and things like that. You have to have somebody that is capable of kind of keeping things up to date and keep nurturing it, keep tuning it, configuring it for your environment. And that really is getting to be more and more of a requirement nowadays. But it
Yeah.
starts with having a good product to work off of. One where you can pull logs into, you can pull telemetry into, you can start creating some alerts, maybe even customize it yourself, and that kind of thing is really going to be pretty pivotal.
Yeah, I agree. And so, without making this an EDR episode, let's kind of talk about at a high level what our expectations are for endpoint detection and response. And so if you're not intimately familiar with EDR and how it compares to things like antivirus and other types of endpoint security products, let's just kind of quickly high level, what I'm looking for is something that goes beyond signature-based detection, right? Signature-based detection has been proven time and time again to be wholly inadequate on its own. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't use anything that does signature-based detection, right? I mean, there are places for that, but no longer is the semantic signature being up to date good enough to get you squared away. And so there are a couple of key things, and you're really more of an EDR expert than I am, so I want you to build on this, but I'm looking for things like correlation of events, right? And so a singular event or finding of a file is not in and of itself, indicative of a larger incident or that endpoint being compromised. What I want are multiple points of information. So that correlation of events. I also want visibility into behavior analytics. And so, there are certain things users don't typically do. And that can delve into all kinds of different stuff, right? Like memory manipulation. It can go into file system manipulation. It can go into a series of events that don't really work together. A good EDR product is going to have both of those things for me. They're going to have that behavior analytics. They're going to have also that correlation to say, hey, this event's cool, kind of, but maybe these 3 events in succession indicate something larger. So what else are you looking for in a good EDR product?
Yeah, when I look at an EDR product, so much of techniques nowadays are, especially like ransomware and very low tech, are just using signed Microsoft utilities or lolbins, which are just built-in Windows utilities, PowerShell, right? And a lot of these EDR products, they're kind of reliant upon AMZ and, like you said, signature-based detections. And if you just start tweaking it a little bit or obfuscating a little bit, all of a sudden the detections just aren't there for it. So
Yeah.
a platform that has, what does EDR mean, right? Endpoint detection and response. And to me, an EDR's job is to, like you said, bring the telemetry together so that you can make educated decisions about it and create anomalies from the data. So even though you patch AMZ, if those PowerShell events, if those things are still being captured in a log somewhere or captured somewhere, I should still be able to at least put some analysis around those or put some logic around those to identify things that are suspicious. So an EDR product that has a platform or some place where you can go to kind of customize the alerting or to customize queries to find that malicious behavior. If you're a third part, or sorry, if you're an MSP or you're getting MSP SOC services, it'd be nice to have like a portal where you can go as a client and kind of log in and see things, right? So that's a consideration for me as well. I was actually just talking with a client on a report debrief call. It's like, hey, our EDR product has like this portal that we can log into and we can query ourselves and we can create alerts, and like that's pretty cool so that you can start customizing it for your environment. So that's something that I think is pretty interesting. And vendors are calling it XDR, and there's all sorts of buzzwords for it. But essentially, a central place where you can start looking at all the data together to identify some of that malicious behavior.
So one of the things that I'm picking up, from what you've said, and you kind of said it outright too, but everything downstream has been supportive. It's not something you just buy, install, and ignore. And so there does have to be some expertise behind it, and not all organizations are going to have that, and that's where having an MSSP or having third-party security staff that can tweak, can support, can make changes, improve on it. You think about any tool in the sense of the word outside of the IT world, man. Think about a hammer. It's only as good as a person using it, right? Same thing can be applied to any number of different similar scenarios, but this is no different in my opinion. Even though it is probably pretty, you get a good one, it's probably pretty decent out of the box, right? It's going to catch 60-70% of whatever the really common get, clone, crappy scary command, whatever it is. But the reality is, man, the the more elevated attackers these days. I mean, how often do you bypass even the best EDRs?
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah. And so, it's that cat and mouse game, and really you have to be a better cat. And your organization needs to, if you can't
Yep.
employ experts, you need to seek out and acquire that
Yep.
expertise somewhere else.
Yeah, perfect example is there was a new AMSI bypass just released, and Darius just this week on this engagement used it to bypass what I think is the #1 EDR product right now.
I agreed.
It's like
Yeah.
a brand new technique. It was on GitHub. It's been on GitHub for at least a couple weeks now, I think.
Yeah.
And you can use it to bypass EDR of this EDR, AMSI on this EDR. So it means new techniques are coming out all the time, and that's why it's so important just to stay up to date. And you should rely on those EDR vendors to stay up to date on those things. You should expect them to be able to stay up to date on those and be on the front lines for you, especially the amount of money that you pay for these products.
Yeah, they're not cheap, man.
But nothing is a silver bullet, and you definitely don't want to take that perspective that, oh, I'm covered, I have the CDR, I'm good to go. You do want to inspect what you expect. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it's part of a larger conversation. And again, I don't want to like super rabbit hole the conversation, but you need to have visibility beyond just behavioral and those type of analytics on that endpoint, right? That's where MDR comes into play, having visibility at different network choke points, and then that layered approach like you've talked about with the least privilege model on part one. And network segmentation and outbound filtering, and you do enough of these fundamental things well, and I think we even used that exact phrase in part one, is do the fundamentals well. EDR is important, but it's just one, cog in the machine that we shouldn't rely too much on. And we do see that a lot. Yeah.
And one of my last pen tests, last thing I'll say before we move on is, on one of my last pen tests, I was detected by everything except the EDR product.
Nice.
So there was multiple security products this client had configured that half of them, and there was like, to be fair, there was like three non-EDR security products. Mm-hmm. One of them was not a security product at all. Like it's an auditing tool, but the client was using it for security monitoring.
Hey man, if it works, it works.
One, it was being resourceful and creative, but I say that to say that, so those 3 security products, and then the 4th was the EDR product. Those other 3 that were not EDR based were the things that got me detected. I bypassed completely the EDR. I blew right by it. But it was these other things that they had in place that had caught our suspicious activity. And these are things, like I said, one was an auditing tool. One is a tool that if I said the name, you'd probably laugh and be like, I've never heard of anyone getting value out of that tool.
Come on, tell me, what is it? I got to know.
Darktrace.
Wow. Okay. Never mind. I'm sorry I asked. All right, keep going.
So, Darktrace used to be like a thing you just laugh at and meme on.
It was a running joke, man.
And this client is getting tremendous value out of it. Now, like it's a fire hose. It takes a lot of work. Yeah. But, my point is there are tools that you can use that get value from security monitoring that aren't EDR. There's a lot of other things that you can do. And, auditing tool was Netrix.
Cool.
So, I mean,
it goes back to what you were saying about being creative and innovative and using the tools that you have to their most effectiveness. And, guys like that, I just want to high five. I just want to be like, bro, you are doing the thing that everybody should be doing. And, unfortunately, it's anomalous, right? That is an anomaly in our world. Yeah. But, a lot of people go out there and they contract for a SIM, they buy CrowdStrike or Carbon Black, they throw it on an endpoint and they're like, boom, I am awesome. And then, you and Darius come in and curb stomp, the environment. So, yeah, no, man, I love it. Really good.
And it took 2+ years for him to get to that point. In discussions with him, it's like, this took 2 years of being in the thing every day for multiple hours a day, like banging your head against the wall to get it to a point where it's even providing some value. So it's not easy, and it's hard to say like, hey, we should invest all this money, and it's by the way, it's going to take us 2.5 years to even see any value out of it. Yeah. It's not an easy conversation to have.
Yeah.
But
it's almost like you get out of things what you put into them.
Yep.
right? To be just as cliche as I possibly can, it
Yep.
honestly is the truth. And so, no, that's great to hear,
Yep.
man. I love hearing stories, success stories like that where,
Yep.
somebody is executing really well on that. So
Yep.
that's cool.
So we kind of beat the monitoring and EDR thing to death a little bit.
Yeah, it was still a
But
good combo though.
as we should, right?
Yeah.
Rightfully so. The other two things for internal, both of them really are I don't see often enough. I think they're underutilized and undervalued. They can be difficult to implement, without a doubt. Like these are not, while they are considered basics or like foundational things, like it's not easy by any means.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one, restricting PowerShell and kind of monitoring PowerShell, and two, application control. So
Okay.
application control being like, software A is allowed to run, software B isn't.
So like
Right?
application whitelisting. Yeah.
Exactly. So starting with PowerShell restrictions, PowerShell is still used extensively by threat actors. It's commonly used to, download additional tools because there's, nice commandlets built in .NET. You can just download files from the internet. So it's commonly used for that, but also commonly used for kind of enumeration and recon. So
Yeah.
like the who am I of PowerShell, if you will. So used a lot for enumeration, used a lot for post exploitation. There's a lot of post exploitation PowerShell frameworks out there. So still used very much extensively, and not restricted enough based on what we see in many environments of, like the SMB space, right?
Yeah.
We're not talking Fortune 100 or anything like that. That SMB space where they have IT people, they have an MSP, they have budget, they have funding, they have resources. They're just not implementing PowerShell restrictions. And that can be very frustrating for an attacker to get on a host and have to use other techniques other than PowerShell, or even risk using PowerShell because of it getting detected.
On one of the last internal penetration tests that I did, the client basically disabled PowerShell, and which I thought was interesting. I just installed my own version. And so I want to be really clear here that we're not talking about nuking PowerShell from orbit. PowerShell is still very much an integral part of IT and maintenance and normal legitimate usage. What you really need to be doing is limiting the dangerous functions, limiting some of the more scary stuff, and then the stuff that you can't disable altogether to set alerts and have monitoring capability for that. Because um, you know disabling PowerShell is almost more detrimental to your organization
Yeah.
than not doing anything at all, right?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. It's not realistic. Your tools as a sysadmin, if you're using PDQ or if you're using deployment, SCCM or like other things, there's a lot of systems that rely on that for automation and
Yeah.
systems administration. So yeah, but you can restrict it with constrained language mode. You
Yep.
can restrict it with application control. And at least get to a point where, okay, now the threat actor can't use this particular technique to launch PowerShell or to use PowerShell. They have to use this other technique that is maybe more noisy, or you create a choke point, right? And now you know kind of the path that they're going to have to go through. They're going to have to load their own PowerShell or bring their own DLLs or whatever the case may be, which hopefully makes more noise and more opportunity to detect them.
Yep.
And that's kind of the idea of application control, is restricting what executables can execute in your environment, what things can run. And eventually you get to a point where you've got a pretty good baseline, and if anydesk.exe runs on your endpoint, like that's unusual, I should probably get an alert based on that. So that's another thing that takes time, it takes investment to kind of get a handle on, but it is a very powerful defensive control if you're able to get to a point where you're doing good application control in an enforcement mode.
Yeah, and I will say, application control is kind of the holy grail of endpoint maturity. In my opinion, in my experience, because it is so difficult to do, and it has so many prerequisites. You have to have strict control over, or at least knowledge and control over all the apps in your environment. They need to be uniform for the most part with versioning and patches and all
Yep.
that. So it is a challenge. Can it be done? Absolutely. There are a lot of organizations doing it and doing it well. but that's kind of, once you get to that point and you've done everything else that we've talked about and you've reached that, you're in really good space.
Yep. Definitely. And you're kind of in rarefied air at that point because,
Yeah.
a lot of organizations, while there are a lot of mature organizations implementing application control, I think we've seen it on pen tests only a handful of times in the
Yeah.
last year.
Yeah.
Really only just a handful
Hundreds
of
of pen
times.
tests, and we've seen it. We could probably count it on one hand. Yeah.
Yep. So not used nearly enough. And it's something that there are additional products. You can use Microsoft's products. There are other commercial products that you can use. There are solutions out there now that are trying to make this a little bit easier. And there's good documentation for it. There's good community support for it. And Microsoft, I think, has a bit of a marketing problem when it comes to application control because, how many admins have even heard of it before? Like, how many people have heard of WDAC or Windows Defender Application Control? So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of built-in features, and the same goes with Active Directory. Protected users. How many people have heard of that and use it?
Yeah.
There's a number of things built into Windows that we're just not using effectively or not using enough or at all. And this is definitely one of those things.
So that kind of, I think, does a good job of hitting all the high points for for preparing and defending against ransomware. Any closing thoughts? Anything you want to kind of put a cork in before we?
Yeah. Obviously, defending against ransomware, that's like a tough, like broad topic. There's a lot
Yeah.
of different things. There's a lot of moving parts here. There's things that, are out of our control as organizations. I think law enforcement has done a pretty good job, taking down breach forums and taking down some of these groups. I would be awesome to see that continue and see more pressure put on these groups. Some of which are hard, right? Because they're in Russia and in non-extraditing countries, so it can be kind of difficult. But that's something that I would like to see more of is government involvement in going after these groups, especially ones that go after hospitals and nonprofits and like less fortunate people who just can't defend themselves as well as they could be, with the same money as private organizations. But it's a big topic. There's a lot of things here. I think my biggest takeaway is crawl, walk, run, right? Start small, do what you can, try and get help, try and communicate with the team, stress the importance of it. And hopefully over time, you get to a place where you have a pretty well-defended environment and you're at least well off compared to your peers in hopes that, if attacker gets on your network, you just make it so much more difficult and they just move on. And, that's a win.
Yeah. And I think, just to kind of reiterate 2 points that we talked about already, but really to send it home is, before you go out and spend a bunch of money on a product, look at what you already have. Look at what's available to you with the things that you already own and maximize their value. Get those tuned and tweaked so that they're performing at their absolute best. If even if you're using relatively simple stuff, this kind of list of topics that we've covered, many of them do not require multi-million-dollar products. Many of them don't require any products really at all that you don't already own. And so, I would tell you before you go out and look at, what's the coolest application control whitelisting product and start going down that crazy road. I mean, are you doing outbound DNS filtering? Are you leveraging that stuff? So I would say that first is like you said, crawl, walk, run, and let's just maximize everything that we already have, because I think people will be surprised at how much value and how much benefit that they can get out of that without spending a ton of money. It might be a lot of time, but you don't have to really break the bank on it. So. All right, folks, that's all the time we have. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff really helps us out. If you didn't watch episode 1 yet, I definitely suggest that you go back and check that out. And we'll see you guys next Wednesday.